Hope everyone's having a wonderful day. Today we're talking about Ford Powerstroke turbo diesel engines. And as you can see right here in the video, we have a 99 to 03 style engine. And that's what we're going to start off talking about. The earlier ones I'm not too experienced on, so I don't want to give misinformation on those. So we're going to start off with these that I know. I've worked on hundreds of these trucks. So let's start off 7.3, 99 to 03. They're all intercooled, unless they're in a van, I believe. But the main thing that really happens with these, overall they're really good engines. Mechanically they're amazing, but they do have some issues. So we'll start off with some of the most common ones. First of all, oil leaks. The 7.3 loves to leak oil. There's a lot of places for it to leak. First you have the high pressure oil pump in the front of the engine. The fittings like to leak, the pump likes to leak. The second place that it also likes to leak is the turbo pedestal if it has the exhaust back pressure valve in it. As you can kind of see in this video, in between that little eyelet and the charge tube, there's a little valve in the exhaust that it closes to heat the truck up. There's a plunger, it's ran by oil, and with that plunger seal starts to leak, and it'll actually leak oil externally. That's a really common leak on these trucks. The next common leak that I see, I haven't seen in a while, but I have seen a lot of it, is the oil cooler. So there's a cylindrical oil cooler mounted on the driver's side of the engine. It's actually really easy to change. You just drain the coolant, drain the oil, take the filter off. Just a few bolts, you can pop it out. It's really just 4 O-rings, big fat O-rings, and then a gasket on the back. Pop it in, you're good to go. Very simple. When I do one of those again, hopefully this winter, usually they start leaking in the wintertime. I'll try to get one recorded for you so you can take a look at it. The next thing that leaks oil in these trucks that is kind of a pain in the butt, if you've ever done one of these, it's the dipstick tube adapter on the passenger side of the oil pan. Now, there are a lot of companies that make aftermarket repairs to this, which I do love because you don't have to pull the engine out to pull the pan off to change it. The factory way, if you're putting a factory part back in it, you actually have to pull the engine out, pull the oil pan, change the dipstick tube adapter, which sits on the side of the oil pan on the passenger side, and then reseal it. But there's companies, you clean it up, you drop the internal piece inside the pan, which it is what it is, and then you just install the new one, it seals up, and it's a really good design. I really like installing them because I don't want to pull the engine on these. These things are just giant, heavy pigs. So with the oil leaks out of the way, let's start on the next one I see. Electrical-wise, is just, the under valve cover harnesses, the harnesses that plug into those underneath the valve cover, and then the connectors that go into the top. Most of the time, it's the connector underneath the valve cover that actually falls out a little bit, and it'll end up burning up on the glow plug side or the injector side. So, very common on these trucks as well. The exhaust up pipes love to leak on these trucks. So, if you are doing them, I don't really recommend the Ford ones because they have these, they're called cushions. They're like kind of gaskets. They're not gaskets, but they're round like donut-y gaskets. And when you install them, they crush. I've seen them leak before after we replace them, so I really prefer the aftermarket ones, but sometimes they're really hard to get them to ship to California because the EPA and all that other crap, so we just usually use the factory ones. So with the exhaust out of the way, the next fuel leak that I see, really actually there's 2, and I didn't write this one down, but the biggest fuel leak I see on these trucks is the fuel filters. They always love to leak. People like to not maintain these engines, so it's always usually the cap or the O-ring that leaks. Put a fuel filter in and you're good to go. But if you look to the kind of the right side of the screen, you'll see that yellow knob on the back. That's called the fuel water separator on the back of the fuel filter housing. It has 2 O-rings that sit on the back. That valve loves to leak. So if you have a fuel leak, it's coming from there. First, look at the cap, make sure the cap's not wet. If the cap's not wet, look down below. It's usually dripping from that fuel water separator. It's got 4, I think T20, T25 torques. It's kind of a pain, but it's really easy to do. Pop it in, you're off on the races. Now, while we're talking about fuel, the next thing that I see that's really common on these trucks, which is going to throw your mind for a little twist, is if you ever have one of these trucks with low power and it throws an ICP too low code. Now, if you understand the way this engine works, it has a high pressure oil system that actually it uses the high pressure oil to force the fuel into the combustion chamber when it fires. So the oil pressure, I think 2,800 to 3,500 psi maximum that it runs on, and then the fuel pressure that's fed to the engine I think is about 60 psi, somewhere around there. But what ends up happening, you'll get an ICP code, like an ICP low code. Actually, it's not an ICP low code. It is an ICP knotted expected, I believe. These 7.3s are very, very vague with that. So you have to know what you're looking at. So you'll get the ICP knotted expected because it doesn't have the correlation between high and low. The computer doesn't know how to determine that. But you just watch the ICP. When you accelerate really hard, you'll see the ICP fall off. It can't maintain, I think it's 2800 to 3500, somewhere in there. I'm not exactly sure. You can watch the IPR percentage and see where it's at. If it starts to change, then you know that the truck's trying to get more oil pressure to drive it. But what usually happens is the truck's losing fuel pressure. So what it ends up doing is it's making the high pressure oil have to work harder, I believe. But I would say 90% of the time when I have those ICP too low codes and the fuel pressure's low, if you drop the tank, there's 2 screens in there. On the ones that I've always seen, 2 screens, they're usually plugged up if the tank has fuel in it. The other thing too is the bottom of that sock. It's not a sock, it's like a rubber round plastic disc. They love to break off. So if it's low on fuel, and it does it only when it's low, it's usually that. But if the tank's like half full and it starves for fuel, like there's not enough fuel pressure, and it has an ICP code, then you know that more than likely that those 2 little filters in the tank are plugged up. Next time I get one of those in, I will record a video on it because it's quite interesting. It throws a lot of people for a loop because it says the truck throws a code for the injection control pressure, which is the high pressure oil system, is too low. But it's not an oiling issue. It's actually a fuel issue. Even if you pull the valve covers and check the IPR, pull the injectors and check them, But overall, I got really too far into that. Overall, 7.3 is actually a really good engine. As they're aging, they are having a lot of wiring electrical issues, But overall, still a very, very good engine for what they are. Good luck finding one low mileage, but still a very good engine in my opinion. One of the best Ford Powerstroke engines ever made, but unfortunately it's made by International, but still a very, very good engine. So far, it's just a heavy pig. But now let's get on to the next one. And unfortunately, you know what truck we're going to be talking about next. It's the 6-liter Powerstroke. So there's mainly 2 differences between these engines as a 6.0. There's an early and a late. The early ones have a round EGR cooler. Mainly the ICPs in the back. They don't have dummy plug and stand tube like the newer 04.5, 05 trucks. If you were to buy one, I would recommend getting the newer style. I mean, they both have their advantages and disadvantages. I believe the earlier trucks, like the 03, 04, they have better power off the line, but they have some weird strategies in the computer for like exhaust back pressure sensor inferred and stuff like that. So I still prefer the newer ones like 06, 07. But let's get into the issues, and there are a lot of them. So obviously, first and foremost, head gaskets. 6.0, tons of just the, I don't know what they were thinking. There's only, I think, 12 bolts that really hold the head down, 12 big bolts, and they just can't do their job. Now, some people say it's from abuse, neglect. I don't know. My personal opinion on that is it's just the design of the engine. Unfortunately, they didn't put enough head bolts. You look at the Duramax, look at the Cummins. They have head bolts surrounding the entire cylinder. These trucks, they're only on the sides. They're not on the top and bottom. So it is what it is. If you stud it and O-ring it, I believe that'll take care of the issue. Definitely if you stud it, it'll help. But I do believe that you do need to have O-ring heads to make it a permanent repair. So with that one out of the way, let's go to the injectors. The really common injector failure on this truck. I mean, it's either electrical or it's mechanical internally. I've seen them get stuck open and start smoking, or they just electrically fail. It is what it is. It's just another issue on these. The next thing that does go bad with a high pressure oil system, which is, I believe, probably one of the worst things on this engine, unfortunately, is there's so many failure points in this truck. There's so many O-rings on the high pressure oil system. It makes it a pain in the butt. And I'm not talking crap about this engine. I don't really like them, but everybody not everybody, but everybody knows that the 6.0s you kind of stay away from them, but the 6.4 is a lot worse, and we'll get to that one in a little bit. But the high pressure oil system is very, very problematic on these trucks. We can start at the dummy plugs, the stand tubes under the valve covers if it's a later style engine, like I was saying earlier. The O-rings like to blow out on those unless they were updated. They updated them to put a Teflon washer on the bottom of them, which is really nice to keep the oil from blowing the O-ring out. So that is a very, very common problem. The injectors, the top of the injector O-rings like to pop out, or not pop out, I'm sorry. They like to blow out. Same thing as like the dummy plug and stand tube. It'll just erode the O-ring. I've seen that many times. High pressure oil pump failure. It's not as common, but it does happen sometimes. The thing that I'm starting to see a lot of lately is IPR failure, which is the electronic solenoid that regulates the high pressure oiling system. And unfortunately, it's behind the turbocharger. It's in a really, really bad spot next to the up pipe. If you ever do replace one of those, Ford does make not updated, but they make a heat shield for them that really never came on pickup trucks that I can see. Some do, some don't. They seem to put them on the bigger trucks like the 450s and up, from what I can tell. But anytime I do an IPR now, I replace that heat shield just so that I don't have to worry about the customer coming back. So keep that in mind if you're doing that. Now let's move on to the EGR system. So again, the EGR cooler, big problem on these trucks. If you do end up having an issue with it, go with the Bulletproof. The Bulletproof is just an amazing product. All their stuff is amazing. So the EGR cooler, what it'll end up doing, from what I've seen, because the original ones are like pressed together inside, and they'll start leaking. It'll start actually leaking the coolant into the exhaust, burning the coolant. You're going to be losing coolant, and that's usually what leads to the head gasket failure. But I've seen head gasket failure without EGR cooler failure, but it definitely doesn't help. EGR system, we're going to talk about the valve, EGR valve. It's kind of a common problem. Sometimes they're intermittent failure on these trucks. It's kind of crazy, but it is what it is. If you have the IDS to test it, we have the factory IDS at work, so I can test the valve, make sure it works perfect. But it is a very common failure. So next one is another common problem is the turbochargers. Now the turbochargers are actually fairly reliable on these trucks besides the vanes inside. This has a variable geometric turbocharger, which actually for the same year the Duramax has used almost an identical turbocharger, but the Duramax, the difference between them is the Duramax is water cooled and it has a position sensor on it to tell where it's at. I don't know if that makes a difference, but the Duramaxes don't have nearly as an issue with their turbochargers as these 6 liters do. So just food for thought. But the problem with these turbos is when they get stuck like that, usually the back end where they have a unison ring, it starts to rot in the back. Even if you clean it and sand it and get it really clean, the unison ring sometimes will get oblonged out. You have to replace the unison ring. And then the back is so pitted on the turbocharger, it usually still binds. So as these trucks age again, we pull them apart, look at them, and it's usually cheaper to put a new turbocharger on there. You can get a turbocharger for about $1,000 now, a little maybe more than that now, for a brand new Garrett, and that's what we buy with the solenoid and everything. If you do put a turbocharger, do not buy a Ford remanufactured. Those are junk. Try to buy a Garrett or at least we use Garrett brand new ones, never had a problem. Beautiful turbocharger. They work great every single time. So now that the turbo's out of the way, the next issue that we're seeing a lot of too as these trucks age is the lifter failure. Now, really no rhyme or reason. Sometimes you don't even know the lifter fails until you lose oil pressure. Until that lifter, the needle bearing, gets sucked up in the low pressure oil pump, and then it wreaks havoc. So it's unfortunate. Another issue, and I will be talking about bulletproofing in another episode. That's going to take a little bit longer for me to put together. But part of our bulletproofing program at work is that we have different stages of it, and fixing that issue is one of them, and it's basically just replacing the lifters. But lifters are a common failure point on these trucks, and sometimes they destroy the cam, sometimes they don't. It is what it is, and it sucks because the cam is actually geared at the back of the engine. It runs off the oil pump runs off the camshaft, so you have to pull the engine out, or you could do it in a truck, but it'd be an absolute nightmare. You might as well pull the engine out. So that's another common issue. Fuel injection control modules. Those are a very common issue. Usually when they get cold outside, that's when they take a crap. They run at 48 volts. People love to put 52, 58 volts in. I don't know why. What I can say is for California smog, the truck knows when you alter the voltage. So if it sees anything above, the 48 volts or, anything above or below it, a certain threshold, it'll throw a code. So then you'll feel your smog in California. So if you do live in California, care about smog, want to replace the FICM, I would not recommend putting one in. If you are looking for a high quality FICM, I would recommend Bulletproof Diesel. They make a 48 volt FICM. Very, very nice. Billet, beautiful FICM. That's what I like to use, but it is a little pricey, but you get what you pay for with that. And also I want to add on the FICM failure. I do believe that batteries and an alternator, that kind of stuff, will cause that to prematurely fail, just like an EGR cooler and a head gasket. So if you are ever having an FICM issue, always try to check your batteries, check your alternator, make sure your charging system, everything is perfect. Because if anything's weak, if you have a bad battery, it can kill that FICM. Because just food for thought, these trucks, they generally, I shouldn't say generally, when they're cold outside, they do not charge for a couple minutes. So as you start the truck, it's killing the batteries. They cannot maintain a voltage enough to charge the batteries for about up to 2 minutes. You don't know how many times in the winter I get these trucks come in and AAA says, oh, it needs an alternator. And I said, how long do you let it run? They said, oh, I just started up and it checked it. You can't do that. You have to let it run for like 5 minutes or so. Then the alternator will slowly start to increase the voltage up. Usually it's about 2 minutes on these trucks, I notice. But always make sure charging system, your alternator is working at top capacity. If you are looking for an upgrade alternator, I would recommend DC Power. They make a really nice alternator upgrade for these trucks. I have them on my truck. I love them. And then obviously batteries. Make sure your battery terminals are clean, tight, everything's in good condition, your grounds are good, and then both your batteries are good. Don't buy cheap junk Walmart batteries and put them in there and expect them to last. These trucks, where I'm at in my climate, we can swing 110 degrees in the summer down to 20 degrees in the winter. We usually see about 2 years out of our batteries, 2 maybe 3. So, that's just life expectancy, especially on these 6 liters, because they just kill batteries. But on to the next one, the oil cooler. So these trucks do have a lot of issues, but they can all be rectified. So the oil cooler, they usually plug up. People like to think it's a sediment in the block when it's manufactured, which I'm not disagreeing with. It's possible. I don't know. So all I have to say to that is the oil coolers are a very repetitive failure. And what I do recommend, if you do have an oil cooler issue, generally to notice if you have an oil cooler issue, you'll notice, like especially when you're towing or driving your truck hard, the oil temp will rise. I believe it's about 16 degrees over the coolant temperature. It'll throw a wrench light on the dash. And it'll throw a P012F for EOT, ECT correlation, for engine oil temp or engine coolant temp correlation. So when that happens, you just make sure your cooling system's good, make sure your thermostat's working, make sure your fan clutch is working. And again, fan clutch is a common problem on these, but not enough for me to make a video about it. So I do recommend, if you do have an oil cooler failure, don't put a factory one back in it. You can, we do, because of price. But if you have the money, you tow a lot, I do highly recommend the Bulletproof Diesel external oil cooler. It's a beautiful billet product. It's very, very nice. Bulletproof Diesel makes some very, very nice products for this truck. There are a couple that I don't recommend, but I didn't say them in this video. But their FICMs, their oil coolers, their EGR coolers, amazing for these trucks. So keep that in mind if you do have a problem with that. But overall, they're okay. If you buy one of these trucks, I would recommend to set some money aside for when things go bad. And unfortunately, with the way that I am, I like to kind of make sure everything's perfect on these trucks. The only way for me to do that is, say, if something happens to it, I would pull the engine out, completely reseal it, assuming the bottom end is good, there's no problems, which rarely there is on these trucks. They have a pretty tough bottom end. Reseal the entire thing. Obviously, head studs, O-ringed heads, bulletproof oil cooler, brand new lifters. Just reseal it, go to town on this thing, make it beautiful. And once you do that, they'll be a good truck, but it will cost a substantial amount of money. I will warn you with that. But they're not bad. It's just, I think people neglect them a lot. But on to the next one, the worst one ever made. So
today we have a 2017
Unfortunately, I don't have any footage of
pickup
that,
truck.
Don't
know what
that I've recently worked
not a dually, so 2500.
To be honest, most of them that come in,
obviously we got
need
6.7.
so much work.
This customer's complaint is they are going through a lot of coolant. They said they had to add 2 gallons of
high
coolant
mileage 6.4
and 300 or 400
turning
miles.
into
So we obviously have a
very
problem.
expensive repair, and it's not going to be reliable. The
I
last
pressure
two
tested it.
Excessive blow by.
I pressure tested it last week. Today is
high pressure
Monday.
fuel
I
pumps
pressure
or oil
tested on
coolers,
Friday.
one of the other.
And I did have a little bit of a
if you
pressure
do anything
exhaust.
these trucks are just so
nothing externally is leaking.
Let's get
Today
on
I
with
pressure
these
tested
failures.
it.
So on the 6.4, they produced
I did have a little bit of a drop, but it was mostly a pressure increase because the temperature outside increased.
My favorite trucks are not really that good looking.
And the customer says they see no external leaks.
But
so
they drive really well.
I'm gonna go ahead
good
and
power when they're running good.
we're gonna go pull this EGR cooler out. And
let's start with the failures. So unfortunately, it's kind of like the 6.0 because it is the 6.0's big
see if I can see something up here first.
The bottom end, I believe, is pretty much the same as the 6.0. So they pretty much suffer from kind of the same thing. So head gaskets is a big problem on the 6.4. Unfortunately, they use the same design because they have the same block as the bottom end. So they only have roughly 12 head bolts, I believe. I can't remember. They don't have nearly as many as they should. And obviously with the extra power output that they have, it just puts more stress on the heads, so they blow the head gaskets. And again, I believe they do make, you can stud them. I don't think we've ever done that because usually they're too blown up by that point. But you can stud it and then do O-ring heads, and you know that hopefully you have good luck with that.
This truck's a little crusty.
But the next common thing that I see is oil coolers. The oil coolers seem to be really bad on the 6.4. Now, I do not recommend. And the only reason I say that is because there's a lot of work to do in a 6.4 versus a 6.0.
Go over here.
6.4 you have to pull the turbochargers out, and turbochargers with the cab on is kind of a pain in the butt. It's just a nightmare. Pull the turbos, pull the intake.
Then we have the bolt down here.
If you do end up having to replace the oil cooler, I do recommend the bulletproof remote oil cooler. Do not use the supplemental oil cooler. Do not use the remote oil cooler. What it does is actually,
and you don't have to pull this to pull the cooler.
It actually takes the oil.
I'm just trying to see if I can see it real quick. It only takes
a
few minutes to pull.
So it's easily accessible.
Because if I have cooling here, I know I'm going in the right direction.
A couple of supplemental
if I don't, then
as much as I love bulletproof diesel products, it's a beautiful product, but it just doesn't work when those coolers are so severely plugged. And if it's plugged already, it's just going to get worse. There's no reason to put a supplemental kit on there. Just replace it. Put the bulletproof remote mount oil cooler on there, and you'll be set. When the cooler goes bad in a year, it'll take you an hour to change it, and it's sitting right outside.
Doing this side now.
Very nice kit. It's the best thing for it.
I got those off.
Now, the next thing we're talking about is the turbochargers. They love to go bad on these trucks. Generally about 100,000 miles when I start to see all these problems crop up on these. Unfortunately, turbochargers are both very expensive because there's two of them. They usually just one of them locks up, or they blow up one of the two. It depends. I mean, I've seen them many different ways on these trucks. But that's another common problem. Again, very expensive because they're labor intensive. The next problem that I see a lot of is the rocker arms. They actually like to break on the 6.4. I don't know why. I've seen it on the 6.0, but not nearly as bad as on the 6.4.
Wetness in there.
The 6.4, they're kind of a pain in the butt. You have to take everything apart and do and take a couple head bolts out, I believe.
At the end of it, yeah, there's nothing in this.
It's totally doable. It's not too big of a deal.
Pulling it.
So,
and see what we see.
The next thing that I would say is you have an issue with radiators too.
It's going to be a little
I don't know if it's designed of the body of the truck, because I've seen a couple of videos where they lift up the wheel on the truck and the radiator flexes, it tries to rip the tanks off the radiator.
Same thing in the EGR valve.
Don't know if that's the case. All I know is back when these trucks, when we see the 6.4s a lot, we used to do a ton of radiators. And it's a pain in the butt. You gotta take the whole front end apart. Don't know what it is about them, but
fortunately,
it is a 6.4 thing, but I do not recommend buying a 6.4.
Or I should actually say cracked cylinder head.
Try to talk them out of them because it's just gonna end up being a headache.
What we've been seeing lately is cracked cylinder head on these.
Something else breaks, say they come in, the turbochargers are blown up, you replace the turbos, and then 3 months later the oil cooler plugged up. It's just completely unrelated, but now we have to pull those turbos back out to do that, and now they have to spend another, I think it's 15 hours of labor to do the oil cooler versus 13 for the turbo. So it just sucks for the customer. I don't like people having to pour money into
connector off.
And you never know where it is. You do the oil cooler, then the head gaskets.
I usually like to push these.
The other thing that I did not state though, that is a common problem. That's
push the whole thing.
People know it, but it's not. I don't think
so
really
usually doesn't break.
Is on the 6.4s, the timing covers like the cavitate, and what it'll actually do is put coolant in the engine light.
Red block.
Then you have to replace the timing cover.
Not my favorite.
Keep that in mind. It is quite an expensive repair because you have to buy a brand new timing cover, but it's all part of owning the 6.4, right?
We'll go ahead and get all this wiring out of the way.
Let's move on to the 6.7, the actual Ford-built engine. So now we're getting on to the actual Ford-made 6.7 liter Powerstroke turbo diesel engine. It's actually not a bad engine. It kind of has some weird issues, but it's all part of ownership, you know. So let's start with the main one, the CP4 failure. Now, it is a very expensive repair to do. They do make kits and stuff to try to take care of it. Currently, actually recently, a kit came out to replace the entire pump altogether, so you don't have to deal with the failure. But I forgot to state that this engine from the 6.7 was produced from 2011 to current. Now, I don't have that much experience in the newer ones. I think I've worked up to about 2019 on those trucks. So just keep that in mind. But CP4 failure, it's common all throughout. They still use a CP4 to this day. The truck rolling off the assembly line, hopefully while we're talking, still has that pump in it to this day. So CP4, very big problem. They make kits to kind of reduce the failure, or you can put it's called a DCR pump. Put a DCR pump in there, take care of that issue so that it never happens again. Now, the next thing that's a really, really common problem, which I hate on these trucks, is the oil pans leak. Don't know why, what Ford was thinking when they built these engines. It's hit or miss on some of them. It seems like about 80 to 100,000 miles when that issue actually crops up. You'll notice the oil leak on the driver's side of the oil pan, right on the bottom of the oil pan, not on the front of the oil pan, right on the driver's side. That's where it starts to leak, and it is a big job. Transmission's got to come out, the lower oil pan, then you got to pull the upper out. You have to use these special Ford wipes to get it clean so it actually adheres. Don't know what they were smoking when they put this thing together, but they need to figure their stuff out because that's just ridiculous. But I just hate people having to pay for that stuff out of pocket, especially when it gets out of warranty, because it is a very expensive repair, unfortunately. So on to the next oil leak that I'm going to mention. It's not so bad, but it still is a common problem, is the vacuum pumps on the front of the engine. Now, usually what I notice when they leak, the bolts are loose, so you can probably tighten them up. For me, being a business, we don't do that. I usually replace the entire vacuum pump. They're relatively cheap. They're a couple $100s. It's cheap insurance for everybody because they're similarly designed as like the German cars used to use back in the day. They still use to this day, but they started using them first. And those ones would actually start leaking out of the back cover. So you don't know if it's leaking out of the back cover. You put it all back together, and then 3 weeks later it comes back leaking out of the back cover. Now you got to do the whole job again and replace the vacuum pump. So for us, you know, it's a couple $100. Put a new vacuum pump in it from Ford. Call it a day. Be done with it. You know, it's perfect. And you'll notice that oil on the front of the engine, like I was saying earlier, if you notice oil on the front of the oil pan, that's usually what it is, that vacuum pump. If you look up, the vacuum pump is actually mounted behind the fan hub assembly where the actual coolant fan mounts to, with that pulley. It's right behind there. So, very common leak on those trucks. The next thing that likes to leak on them is the injector seals. That I think it's for the intake manifold, because these trucks, they're hot V, so the turbocharger, exhaust manifolds, everything's in the valley, and the intake manifolds are actually top of the cylinder head, or the valve cover, whatever you want to call it. But I think it's the valve cover, but it's where the injector goes through and it seals into the top of the valve cover, or whatever you want to call it. Those really common to leak. Not too big of a job. You just got to pop all the injectors out, get new lines and bolts because they're all torqued to yield. The seals, you can put them in by hand, pop them out with a screwdriver, push them in with your thumbs, and put the injectors in, you're off to the races. But those aren't too bad to do. Very common problem, unfortunately. The next one is a big deal that irritates the crap out of me. Turbocharger. I don't know what it is about Ford. They cannot get a good turbocharger in these trucks. It's just absolutely ridiculous. So, I mean, I don't care if I've seen them early, I've seen the 2011s, I've seen the newer ones fail. I don't understand. I just had a truck the other day. It was a 2019. I posted a short on it. Turbocharger blew up, and the customer actually drove with no oil pressure. So they took it to the dealer to hopefully it gets covered under warranty, because I can't be certain that the engine's any good if they drove it 10 miles with no oil pressure. So I'll let them deal with that. It's not my headache anymore. But these turbochargers, they usually just blow up catastrophically. Generally, they don't smoke. They start to make noise. That's usually the telltale sign. The other thing that I will tell you, if you do have a turbocharger failure, I would check your crankcase pressure. One thing that I've noticed with these trucks is that the crankcase pressure is really high when the turbocharger goes bad. And my personal crazy belief is that crankcase filter gets plugged up, which it's a filter, it's a maintenance item, it should be replaced, but I don't think it's on a maintenance schedule. when that filter gets plugged up, it increases the pressure in the crankcase, so the oil drain on the turbocharger is actually directly connected to the crankcase, obviously, because it's oil return. But what I do believe is that crankcase pressure gets around the bearing on the turbocharger and starves it for oil. That's just a theory of mine. The only reason I came up with that theory is because I had a truck that another shop did 5 turbochargers in, and it was ready for its 6th within, I think, 4 or 6 months. So there was definitely a problem that I needed to figure out, and I checked that truck up, down, left, and right. And what I found is it had excessive crankcase pressure from the crankcase filter being restricted. I replaced the turbocharger with a brand new turbocharger from Garrett. I replaced the crankcase filter with a filter from Ford, and that truck has been perfectly fine for, I believe, about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years. So it's habit now. Any truck that comes in gets a turbocharger. Generally, they happen about 100 to 150,000 miles. It gets a new crankcase filter if it's original. And the way you can tell your crankcase filter is original is on the top there should be a sticker. And now this is the older trucks, I believe 11 to 16, because they have the one-piece filter assembly that you have to change the whole cartridge. The 11 to 16, it should have your injector numbers on, your IQA codes. If it has IQA codes, more than likely that crankcase filter is original. The newer ones, they actually have a lid, which I like. It makes it a lot easier to change. There's a lid, you pull it off, change the filter, put the lid back on, you're ready to rock and roll. So keep that in mind if you are doing that. I would make that part of your maintenance schedule, maybe every 50 to 70,000 miles, change that filter just to prevent any problems, because you don't want it causing issues. So the next thing, and these trucks do have a lot of issues. I'm not going to call them garbage, because they're not. They have a lot of issues. The next thing is the exhaust manifolds. Now, I've been bitten by these many, many times, because the truck will come in, the turbocharger's blown up in it, put a turbo in it, and then the exhaust manifold starts leaking, because now the turbocharger can actually work and build pressure. It can make back pressure in the exhaust. So usually what happens is the back and the front bolts on the driver's side manifold, for some crazy reason, like to pop. So if you are in that situation, what I would recommend is BD Diesel does make a kit for some crazy manifolds with some crazy studs and stuff. I've used them before. It works pretty well. I don't mind them, but I don't really care either the Ford ones, because the Fords, they update the studs on the front and the back of the driver's side to make them longer. So I don't know. Hopefully it actually helps, because that's what I've been doing. That's what they sell, so that's what we do at work. But those exhaust manifolds, they just love to leak. Usually a hiss or a hiss or a buzz when you accelerate, and some smoke from under the hood. The other thing that I did not notate on these, because I have a little list right here in front of me, is the charge tubes on these trucks. I don't care what year it is. I've seen it all the way from 11 to the last one I did was a 19. Charge tube is a piece of crap plastic charge tube. Don't know why Ford. I don't know what their deal is over there, but that charge tube is such a piece of junk. They love to crack and blow up. I've seen them on a truck blow up as low as, I think it was 60 or 50,000 miles. So, don't know what the deal with that is. They need to figure this out, because all I can say is, and I'm not bashing Ford, not bashing nobody. The Duramax uses a plastic charge tube, and they don't have nearly as many issues as those 6.7, the plastic charge tubes that the Ford use. The Duramax ones feel really thick. They feel well built. The Ford one is a really flimsy piece of junk. I don't know why they can't figure that out, but I've changed less than probably 2 or 3 of the plastic ones on the Duramax. I've changed probably 20 or 30 on these Fords. And the Ford ones, when they break, they're on back order. So makes a really interesting conversation for our customer. But if you do buy one of these trucks, do something about that CP4 in there. Either put an XG fuel metering valve in it. That's what I usually like to do. Quick and dirty. What it does is it actually keeps the metal in the pump and in the tank, so it doesn't send it to the high side of the system. So when it does blow up, you're not replacing the entire system, just the pump and the tank. You're cleaning the tank and flushing everything out. You don't have to mess with the injectors and stuff. Or I think S&S makes a really nice remote filter thing, which I probably would go with that now, just because I like the idea it filters it all out, so that when it does blow up, all you really have to do is change the pump. You don't have to drop the tank and clean the tank out, which is just kind of annoying. But it is what it is, whatever you would like to do. If you have the money, go with the DCR, If you're trying to make it a bulletproof truck, just extremely reliable, and you have the money, you could do it in stages, but definitely do some type of upgrade the exhaust manifolds. Maybe put a upgraded turbocharger in there. I know in 15 or 16 they changed the design to internally fed oil. Don't know if it makes a difference, but I just had to do one of those. So hopefully it makes a difference for the customer and makes it more reliable for them, I hope, because it was a lot of money to do that repair. So maybe new turbo, new exhaust manifold, do the DCR pump, crankcase filter, just put all the money in it and be done with it. But it's up to you. But overall, they're not bad. The one thing I will say is I have seen more blown up 6.7 Fords than I have of Duramaxes ever built, but that's just from what I see. I don't know if, they say Fords are #1 selling truck, which I'm sure they are, so maybe that's the result of it, but I'm just giving you what I see, not being objective in any manner. But overall, they're a decent engine. I mean, you just got to keep an eye on them. But if you have any comments or concerns, please put them down below. And if you like this video, please thumbs up it. And if you didn't like it, thumbs down it and tell me why down below. I'm really curious. And just so you know, I wasn't bashing on any of these trucks. This is all my opinion. I've worked on, at this point in my life, thousands of these trucks. So I have a set idea. And I'm sure I forgot some stuff, but the stuff that I wrote down in front of me, I made sure that it was stuff that I see it extremely often to where it isn't a problem. Like on a Ford, I'm not going to, like the 6-liter, glow plug control modules go bad, the vacuum pumps go bad. There's a lot of other stuff I could list. The AC systems on those the 6.0s are junk. The compressors lock up. I could have added that, but, the alternators go bad and all kinds of stuff. But I'm putting the stuff that I see very, very common just to be fair with everything. I'm not calling them junk. It is what it is, But overall, the 6.7 is a decent truck. Just make sure you take care of that fuel issue. The CP4, that's one of the biggest things, and you'll have a good time. But thank you for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, and have a great day.